Welcome to the Actionable Futurist podcast, a show all about the near-term future with practical and actionable advice from a range of global experts to help you stay ahead of the curve. Every episode answers the question, what's the future of? With voices and opinions that need to be heard. Your host is international keynote speaker and actionable futurist Andrew Grill.
Today's guest is Byron Reese, a long-time serial entrepreneur who has started half a dozen companies over the last 30 years. He writes about human potential, automation and artificial intelligence, providing both a historic and futurist context for the advances of new trends and technologies. His first book was a defense of techno-optimism called Infinite Progress. He followed that with a philosophy book about AI and robots called The Fourth Age. We're here today to talk about his latest book titled Stories, Dice and Rocks That Think, How Humans Learn to See the Future and Shape It. Amazing title. It's about how humans learn to see into the future and how that radically altered our trajectory as species. Byron's also a CEO of an AI company he started and is working on his next book. Welcome, Byron.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, it's such a small world. I said just before we came on air that I was listening to a podcast you did with Peggy Ann Saltz. Hi, Peggy, if you're listening. We're going to take a slightly different tact because it's unusual to have two futurists on the same podcast. It's only happened twice before on the show. So I wonder what the collective noun for a group of futurists is.
That would probably be a bewilderment of futurist or I don't know. It would be a speculation of futurists. That's what we would be.
A fascination of futurists, maybe something more forward-thinking. You call yourself a futurist, so do I. How would you define what a futurist is?
What futurists try to do is figure out why the future happens the way it does. What causes it to unfold a certain way? And that usually requires you to spend a lot of time in the past. And that's why I mainly write about the past, because, that's how we can kind of figure out why things happen the way they did.
Well, it's very true. And I was just musing when I was reading your book that it is a look backwards. It's slightly ironic for a futurist, but you're right. We have to learn how to think and how things might look and look at precedents and all those sorts of things. I mean, the law is full of precedents. Most law these days is predicated on something that's happened before. So why did you write it in the first place? It's a really interesting read.
I wrote that book because I wanted to answer the question of how people and animals were different. Because you always hear, we're just another animal. And yet, it sure doesn't seem that way. Like, we seem to have had an extraordinarily different outcome than any other animal. And so I was very curious why that was. What's so special about us? I mean, look, dolphins, I'm sure, are smart. What have they done lately? I'm not expecting them to have the internet, but they don't even have, the postal system yet. They don't even have writing. And why is that? That's what this book was about.
You made a couple of interesting observations about why we're different from animals. We accumulate knowledge. We also believe in the future and the past. And you're right. In Act 2 of the book, it's in 3 acts, we'll get to all of them, you talk about the foreseeable future. So as you say, you've got to look backwards to understand what goes forward. The book's in 3 acts. Why did you structure it into 3? Are there moments in time where you said, okay, now we're moving from Act 1 to Act 2 and so on?
I wrote the book trying to just figure out that basic question. So you then say, okay, how are we different? Well, cognitively, we're different. And then, I had the whole story I tell about Homo erectus, this very successful creature that lived 2 million years and how they weren't like us. And then, that leads you to, something happened to us, probably related to language. You mentioned the future and the past. That took me to these caves in Chauvet and in France to see this cave art that just kind of came out of nowhere. The whole book could have been about that, but I kind of got to the end of that and said, yeah, we became a species that thought about the future and imagined the future, but then we decided we wanted to predict it. And that's a very different thing. Like, I can imagine a future, but that's a very different thing than predicting it. And that's what got me into probability. I never really intended for the book to go there. It sounds like chloroform in print to say the middle third of the book is about probability. It's about how we had to learn to think differently about why things happen the way they do. And that gets you back to being a futurist. I just loved the phrase, the foreseeable future, because it is foreseeable. Whatever horizon that is, just that idea. Animals don't know there's a future and a past, nor should they, because they don't really exist. The only thing there is this moment right here. And the future and past are these abstractions. And it's been tested a lot, and there's dissenting opinions on it. And then the third act was just inevitably flowed out of it because we learned probability, which was a way to like predict the future. Eventually, we hit a limit to what we could do with pad and paper. And so we decided we needed to build machines that could see the future. And those are the rocks that think, those are the computers.
I was fascinated with the trajectory going from Act 1 to Act 2 and this whole notion of probability. You mention a simple coin toss game that a third-year student could do easily these days, but take me back to 1654 when Pascal was writing to his friend and they suddenly had that, as we'd say in Australia, that eureka moment when they realised that they could reason about how to work this out. Because what intrigued me about your book is that we all think that we're pretty smart, but it's actually been a journey where we've had to evolve and now we've got technology that helps us. Rewind back to 1654. That for me was amazing about the whole notion of probability.
There had been a math problem that had been circulating for 100 years that people had been trying to work on, and nobody had solved it. And as you point out, it's a trivially simple problem. And the quickest way I can sum it up, it's two people, and they decide to play a game where they're going to flip a coin 5 times. And one person gets a point every time heads come up, and one person gets a point when tails come up. And they're going to flip 5 times. At some point in the game, the score is 2-1. The heads guy is winning, and they have to stop the game. It's unclear why, like their coin fell through a crack in the floor or something. I don't know. But that's the setup. It's like, okay, we've stopped the game. The score is 2-1. What's the fair way to split the pot? Think about that, though. Like, even if you instinctively don't know the answer, perhaps you can intuit it's not a hard question. And yet you had all these big brain people in Europe writing about it, coming up with all these different answers that weren't the right answer. And then Pascal and Fermat are trading letters back and forth. And what they kind of figured out is, well, if you treat the future as a series of things that could happen, and then you assign chances to how often each one of those happens, then you can predict an event and use that to decide how to split the pot. It's easy to look back and say, wow, how did they not get that? But of course, they had just come out of using Roman numerals, which are notoriously difficult to divide with. Basic operators that we use, like the equal sign, had just been invented. So it was still early days. Within 8 years, you had entire textbooks of probability theory. It was why, like you said, an aha moment that they just got it all of a sudden. And what they had to do was make some logical leaps. If somebody asked me, if you flip a coin 1,000 times, how many times is it going to come up heads? I would say about 500. But the only reason I would say that is I have been taught that. I've never done it. I don't know anybody who's done it, but I've been told that. But if I had not been told that, I would have probably said, well, you just don't know, right? Maybe it's 200 the first time, and then exactly 500 the next time, and then 800 the next time, and maybe the next time it's only 150. That's what it feels like. But the odds of it not being between 400 and 600 in that narrow range, the odds of it not being in that range are 1 in billions. Like, it's not going to happen. And so all of a sudden you get this like dawning that there's randomness, but there's also predictability in that. And that's this like, whoa moment that they kind of had to grapple with and wrap their heads around. And then once they did, and then they said, here's how you think about these things, then you just see everything else forming. You see life insurance and annuities and discounted present value and all these things like that, that just, it was like the time was right.
So that's what fascinates me about the book, because all these things that we think are obvious, someone else had to discover, and then it becomes a told story. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But something I was thinking about as you were speaking, back in 1654, did humans have the same brain capacity as we have today? And it's just a couple that just had that extra moment where they discovered that it then became a story, it then became fact, and then people could basically pull on that. Because you think about it, all those things, or probability theory, I learned it at university and at school. I now know what to expect, the 50% heads and tails, because of what we know now, because someone's told us. But did we have the brain capacity back then of today, or are we smarter now? Psychologically, physiologically, what's the difference between the 1600s and the 2022s?
Fantastic question. I have all these things that are running towards the door to answer it. There's a well-documented effect that IQs seem to be rising in the immediate past, the last 100 years or so. And there are reasons for that, and I think we could say that's true. It's also been speculated that human intelligence peaked about 1,000 years ago, and we've been going downhill from there. We know our brain size peaked a long time ago, and it's been going down, but that isn't necessarily the thing. The way I would answer that question is, you have to think that up until 100, 200 years ago, we all were farmers. Surviving was was a full-time job. And you didn't have the luxury to go to bed at night thinking about probability and waking up thinking about probability. The economy just couldn't afford a bunch of Pascals and Fermats to sit around and ponder that. And so what happened is over time, technology and income rose and harnessed more energy. And you all of a sudden had a group of people we call scientists. It's a brand new word that didn't exist. And there really weren't many people like that. And now there are lots of them.
So I alluded to the fact about told stories, and the whole section of the 20 purposes, in fact 21 if you read the epilogue, of told stories was the most interest to me because I hadn't thought about it this way, and I'm not going to read them all. You say that most of the hundreds of decisions we make daily are based on stories about the future, and that same story can teach ethics, history, useful knowledge, and be entertaining. How did you come up with these 21 in the first place?
Oh, that was a lot of fun. If you're going to write a book about stories, you read a lot of stories. Like, I read so many storybooks. And I mean, I'm talking fairy tales to myths to epics to all of these fortune cookies, like everything I could get my hands on. And I just read lots of stories. And so every time I would read one, I would think, why would this have survived? I mean, that's really the question, right? Because the vast majority, very few of my stories are going to be told in 500 years, right? Somehow Jack and the Beanstalk does survive. And you said, I wonder why. And so that was it. I mean, that took me years to make that list. And you're right about the 21st one in the epilogue. I think you're the first person to mention it because the book's so new.
I'm just going through some of them now. Some of them are obvious. Teach information is number 3. Number 5 is enforce social norms. Promote empathy is number 10. Provide entertainment is 15. That's an obvious one. But then we get into some of the more serious ones. Explain how things got the way they are. Why is this so? Preserve history, imagine the future. These seem like fundamental things that we use stories for. But then again, as I'm thinking, the reason that Pascal and others were able to look at the theory of probability is because someone came before us and did that. And you could also argue that the Bible is a 2,000-year-old set of stories that we still go back to as well. I think there are lots of examples around the world of where stories enhance what we've done and they actually allow us to not have to do the heavy lifting. Is that where you see it?
The way I set it out is we learned to talk, and so we got this sophisticated language, and we actually got the language to learn how to think, not to communicate. And the language gave us something known as displacement, where we could talk about the future and the past. And so we started thinking about the very immediate future, like the next minute. I could do that, or I could do that. And if I did this, that would happen. And if I did this, this might happen. And those are all little stories you tell yourself in your head. And that's, I think, what we use stories for all day long, every day. It's reflexive, like to ourselves. We call them maybe scenario planning. But even when you're thinking about, like, what am I going to have for dinner? And then you think about how much work it's going to be to make this, or you could do, like, those are these stories. And then at some point, just like with language, we started talking, we started telling these stories and externalizing them. And that all came, I think, much later and has accumulated over time. I think the coolest thing is how the stories that we tell have changed as human civilization has changed. So you think about the very oldest stories we have are about the stars, where you would expect them kind of to be. If you were a young species just kind of waking up, that would be the biggest show in town. And then they, became about urban life. Then they became about strangers, like there were these people called strangers that you didn't used to have when there were only 120 people in your band. And so how do you deal with strangers and all of that? And so the cool thing is that you can see humanity at maturing stories change. Or you can kind of, maybe not even maturing, but you can see kind of the human story being told out in the stories that we tell.
I'm wondering if today in 2022, we have too many stories. So we have Twitter, we have Facebook, we have Netflix, we have multiple news channels. I was saying to someone yesterday, or running through all the different subscriptions, news services I have. So I'm wondering if the art of storytelling, we're just being overloaded. Even 50 years ago, you think about the number of radio channels and TV stations you had in your town and I had here in the UK or in Australia. We actually had very few choices. And the whole broadcast thing, I think in the UK here for many years, there were 2 channels. There was the BBC and there was the commercial ITV. And so they had amazing ratings because you either watch one channel or the other. These days, you are literally overloaded with choice. And so I'm wondering whether the power of storytelling is getting lost and our dear little brains are being fried by too many stories.
I don't know. I hadn't thought about that. Weird Al Yankovic talked about how hard it was to do his thing now because there just aren't the kinds of songs that there used to be back in the 80s and 90s that everybody knew. Everybody hears. Every now and then you get one. and then he can jump on it, and everybody's like, have you seen that? And that might be the real loss, is not that we have too many stories, but that we all have different ones. I can say something to you like, don't be the boy that cries wolf. That's enough. Like, what I'm saying then. But there's a story there, right? Wolf, wolf.
Well, I think it's also generational. I keep hearing stories about millennials that are discovering the Beatles saying, this is amazing music, or even the Friends TV show, people are now saying, oh, this is amazing, or it hasn't travelled so well. So I think we're now cycling through, because you've got so many ways to look at past content. You can just browse YouTube and find almost anything. I think we're now recycling that. But I want to take just a slightly different tack, and I'm hoping you haven't thought about this either, in that I'm giving you something to noodle on. In the world of fake news and misinformation, how will this affect told stories in the future? So if the story is not true and it becomes folklore, it becomes believed, how do we continue to trust people with these told stories if they're not true?
If you go through the list of 21, most of them don't require the story to be true. Was there a boy who cried wolf too many times? I don't know. Maybe. And, there probably wasn't Jack and the Beanstalk. If you're talking about like current events and politics and all of that, that's a different arena. Every Greek play, every Greek tragedy I can imagine, all the stories of the Greek gods, the veracity of the story is incidental.
I want to move into Act 3. You say we're at the dawn of Act 3, the period we're in now. What do you think the biggest economic, social and political challenges of Act 3 for humans might be?
Act 3 begins in 1954, 300 years after Act 2 begins. And it begins because we could do all these cool things with probability, but there was a limit. So we built machines to do it. And then we got really clever, and instead of just building machines to do it, we also got machines to collect data for us. So the machines could collect information and then process it. Artificial intelligence is a pretty simple technology. It says you take a lot of data about the past and you look for patterns, and it uses patterns to predict the future. And that's what it is. It works because we can muster lots of data and we can process it very intelligently. And it gets better mainly because we have more powerful computers. The reason we wanted to predict the future is we wanted to control it. Like, I wanted to be able to know what was going to happen so I could affect it. And that's still the dream. That's still the dream. Because we think, well, if we got all these computers and they all gather all this data and then we processed it all, we could predict the future with an enormous amount of confidence in the immediate short term, and then less as time passes. And that's still what we try to do with it. Of course, it's fraught with possibility and it's fraught with danger. And we don't know how that's all going to shake out.
So just to rewind to Act 3 to 54, I'm so glad that happened because I now have a career because of it. The transistor digital computer was invented back then. I'm a child of the space race. I was alive seeing man land on the moon in 1969. I think it's actually, as we record, around the anniversary time of that. And so because they had to go into space and things had to be small and light, everything was miniaturized. And so the space race actually drove innovation. But I'm just wondering, with all the innovation we've had, things are getting faster. We'll talk about AI a bit more in a minute. What do you think the next 50 years will look like, and what would be the main driver of innovation in the next 50?
It used to be the only place we could write information down was in our DNA. I mean, we're talking for billions of years. And then all of a sudden, when we got language, our DNA moved. We had our DNA, but then we had more in our head, basically. And so instead of having to evolve knowledge not to eat the purple berry, you can just say, hey, dude, don't eat that purple berry. And that was it. It didn't take 10 million years. And that could spread. I mean, it's just like DNA. And then I got really interested in, there was an old essay written a long time ago called I, Pencil by a guy named Leonard Reed. And he pointed out back in the 50s, nobody knows how to make a pencil. Nobody knows how to make a pencil. Like, there's no person on the planet who could mine the ore and refine it to the steel and make the ferrule and crimp it and all of it. Like, there's nobody. And so then you say, well, how in the world does a pencil get made? And the short answer is they say, oh, well, you do a little bit and you do a little bit and you do a little bit. But that's a little bit of that's like mechanically how it happens. But how does it really happen? It's because our DNA is now at a species level. It's not just in our heads. There's actually a way to make pencils. And humanity can make pencils. Humanity knows how to. And, humanity can make an iPhone. No person can make a smartphone, but humanity can. And it has 60 different elements in it. And your body only has 30. So it's probably even harder to make than making a person, right? And so, if you think that way, if you think that's like our planetary DNA, it's becoming this gigantic repository of this knowledge of ours. And then what you mentioned right at the very beginning, the reason the dolphins don't have telegraphs is because every generation, our knowledge accumulates and theirs resets. That's why every beaver makes the same dam they've made for thousands of years, but ours doesn't. I was born into, a different world than even Leonardo da Vinci was born into. I have so many more advantages over a Leonardo, and it's going to continue to accumulate. So, to answer your question, 50 years from now, I hope that our planetary DNA continues to grow in intelligence. Data is just knowledge of the world. And for the longest time in human history, when you died, everything you knew died with you. And maybe a couple of things you told somebody, and then maybe they forgot them or messed them up, or just decided they didn't like them, or maybe they died. Like, humanity's whole story is learning and forgetting and learning and forgetting and learning, forgetting. And I know we don't think this way, but really, 50 years from now, they'll look at how we made decisions, and it looks like we are just winging it. Like, we just go through life on anecdotal evidence, and it's like, where are we going to go on vacation? I hear Miami's nice. Let's go to Miami. Like, that's it. That's like the amount of introspection we have, like, on big life decisions. And what hopefully happens is when you have these computers and these sensors that are logging everything, they're saving everybody's life experience, so that everything you do in your life is actually going to become the data to make somebody else's life better. And that's the real way you make progress, I think, as a species. You don't reinvent the wheel every generation, forget everything, erase it all. You accumulate it, and now we can accumulate it in a far different way.
Well, if I paraphrase what you're saying, it sounds like we may need to turn things over to the machine. And one of the biggest questions I'm asked as a futurist are things like, will automation reshape the workplace? Will robots take our jobs? Will AI displace human intelligence? You cover AI, machine learning a lot in the book. You do that in the work you're doing today. Are we destined to a future where we work harder and harder for less? I heard on another podcast you were talking about the fact that artificial general intelligence will probably never happen. That's probably a whole other podcast. But talk to me about where automation, machine learning, AI will start to really help us innovate so we don't have to be thinking so much. As you say, all this data that's there already, the machines can make some sense of it and learn about the things that we need to do so we can leapfrog and we can have the high value tasks rather than doing all the minutiae of our lives.
If you went back in time 25 years to, what would that be, 97, you took somebody aside and said, you know what, 25 years, billions of people are going to use this technology. What do you think that's going to do to jobs? They would have said, maybe, the travel agents are going to go out of business, and the stockbrokers, people will just buy their own stock, and the shopping malls are going to go under because people will just buy stuff online, and the newspapers will start failing because people get all their news online, and on and on and on. And they would have been right about everything. However, nobody would have said, oh, well, you're going to have Google, Amazon, Etsy, eBay, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and 10,000 other things. You're going to have Uber and Airbnb and all of these things. And that's the problem. The problem is it's easy to see what's going to get destroyed. That's the easiest thing in the world. It's impossible to see what's going to be created. There's a reason, the internet came out and then 3 days later, there was not a ride-sharing service. That took 10 years. Most of our innovations of the near future are going to be about how we apply technology, not like, do we come up with something new? What technology does is it's a force multiplier of humans. It increases what you're able to do. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out the half-life of a job. In the last 250 years in the West, it's 50 years. I think every 50 years we lose half of all the jobs. And yet, somehow we maintain basically full employment and generally rising wages. And you say, well, how? Well, what happens is technology is always creating these new jobs, quote, high pay, high skilled jobs, and it's destroying these other jobs that are low paid, low skilled jobs. And that makes people nervous because what they say, well, do you really think those people that had these low skilled, low wage jobs are going to be able to do these new high tech jobs? And it's like, well, no, that's not how it works. What happens is everybody just shifts up one little notch. It's like the new high-tech job comes up and somebody slides into that and then somebody backfills them all the way down the line. That's the economic story of the last 250 years, is technology's always in there, destroying stuff at the quote-unquote bottom, creating stuff at the top, and we all just slide up that. And I don't have a sense that we're losing jobs any faster or slower than about half of them every 50 years. I'll ask you, in the last 5 years, can you think of any job that technology's eliminated? Any job?
In the 5 years, no. And I'm with you that I believe that there's evolution, because years ago, when we wanted to lift something heavy and we weren't able to do it, we built a machine that could do it. So you might say, well, the person who lifted things, he or she's out of a job. And no, they were then in charge of the lifting thing and the pulley system or whatever. I suppose you could argue that the typing pool is no longer there because we have word processors, we do it ourselves. But that's probably 20 or 30 years away. And I don't know anyone that would want to be sitting in a typing pool today typing out letters.
So if there really aren't any material ones in the last 5 years, and this idea that like, oh my gosh, we're in for this massive displacement, I think there's a lot of people for various reasons that want to scare people. And I think that's a really easy way to do it, because it speaks to people's livelihoods and their abilities to provide for themselves and their families and their relevancy and their ability to contribute to society. And you run headlines that say, you're going to be useless and unable to take care of yourself and provide for other people. You get a read. And then if you do that 100 times a day, then people start worrying about it. And then if you start making movies about it, and not because you're trying to sell something, but movies need conflict, then all of a sudden people start seeing it. They go, oh yeah, that's what's going to happen. We then start doing something called reasoning from fictional evidence. We see all these things in the movies and all that, and we say, oh, that could happen. I mean, look, I like to see Will Smith fight the robot as much as the next person. It's not a documentary about the future, I don't think.
I think if you look back to Space Odyssey 2001, Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke, that was very forward-thinking. And in fact, just with my movie geek hat on, the special effects and the way they filmed that were literally out of this world back in 1968, 1969. And if you're a movie buff listening out there, there's a whole book, it's about 600 pages long, that shows how that movie nearly didn't get made. And in fact, Arthur C. Clarke is one of my favourite futurists, and he seemed to get it right. He predicted satellites and all things. Did he know something that we didn't know?
Did he have an avatar from the future visiting him and telling him those sorts of things? Perhaps. No, I don't know. I really don't know. I will say there'll never be another movie like 2001. There cannot possibly ever be a movie that far ahead the state of the art at the time was. I mean, we already had things that are virtually realistic, so you're never going to get something that's like that far ahead of the state of the art. Like, it's already almost completely believable. That was a watershed moment.
I was reading something today where Apple and Samsung were in a dispute about who created the tablet first, and they went back and said it was in 2001. The movie producers actually took some of the smarts out of it because they thought it would be not realistic enough. So actually the tablet's been around for a long time. So we're almost out of time. I'm at the favourite part of my show where we run our guests through a quick fire round. We've learned a lot about you. We can read the book, but I want to learn just that little bit more. So I'm going to ask you some quick fire questions. So one sentence answers are the best ones. iPhone or Android?
iPhone.
Window or aisle?
Window.
Online or in the room?
Online.
Your biggest hope for 2022 and beyond?
I hope that kind of the malaise and worry about the future that we seem to be getting, the one thing that'll really get us, because if people give up on the future, then that becomes self-fulfilling. So I hope that people have a reason for optimism.
What's the app you use most on your phone?
One of those apps that records your pulse, because I turn it on and I put it on my finger and then I just breathe deeply. And that's how I think and reflect. And I just quietly do that. And I don't know, there's something rhythmic about it. But I just saw I have 28,000 readings on my phone from that.
What's the one thing you won't be doing again post-pandemic?
Going to a doctor's appointment in person. It's like, how in the world did we not get, like, I don't have to spend half a day and go, like, check into some office around coughing people.
I love asking this question to authors. What are you reading at the moment?
I love reading research reports. Like these 14-page, densely written, heavily footnoted thing. Because what I learned is that everything is somebody's passion. And so you find that 14-page thing about there's one animal that has a gear for a body part. That's it, just one. And like you find the man or woman that writes about that and you can just feel it coming through. So I love to read academic research of all things because I just love the passion of it all.
And final quickfire question, how do you want to be remembered?
There's a movie called 47 Ronin and it has a line in it. Soon we'll be dead and all that will be left of us are the pleasant memories our children feel when they hear our name. That's what I want to be remembered as a good father.
This is the Actionable Futurist podcast. So can we give our listeners 3 actionable things they should do today when it comes to better predicting their own future?
You know how I was talking earlier about how technology destroys what you called minutia at the bottom, these kind of repetitive, and it creates opportunities at the top. You can think of that as a macro thing, but I find applying that to your own life is really useful. Ask yourself, what technology can I employ to destroy things I'm doing right now that are wasting my time? And what technology can I use to open up opportunities? And if you do that, you will never be obsoleted. I mean, you'll always be saying, okay, I'm going to destroy this part of my life and use that time to do this part. I find that to be very useful, to think about that personally.
Byron, how can people discover more about you and, importantly, purchase the book?
I am the easiest person in the world to find. I'm ByronReese.com, on Twitter, everywhere. My email address is ByronReese@gmail.com. I am so easy to find.
Fascinating discussion today. I really enjoyed the book, and thank you so much for your time today.
I had a great time.
Thank you for listening to the Actionable Futurist podcast. You can find all of our previous shows at actionablefuturist.com. And if you like what you've heard on the show, please consider subscribing via your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. You can find out more about Andrew and how he helps corporates navigate a disruptive digital world with keynote speeches and C-suite workshops delivered in person or virtually at actionablefuturist.com. Until next time, this has been the Actionable Futurist podcast.